Well, hello, my friends of the gathering. Pastor Bob coming to you for our second to last session on Genesis this summer. I know you're thinking, hey, wait a minute, we've hit all our weeks. Well, Pastor Ryan and I have one bonus section coming up that we're going to share with you that we're excited to cover with you. That should come out here very shortly after this video, if not with this one. But again, we just want to thank you so much for a wonderful summer and the opportunity we've had to walk through Genesis with you and cover a lot of really awesome things. So, as always, thank you very much to Bill Epley, to the whole team, to Judd, to Bill, everybody for allowing us the opportunity to grow alongside you this summer. We are abundantly grateful and looking forward to learning more as we walk towards Christ together this year. With that said, let me get started by praying, and we'll get moving here with our lesson. Gracious Father, thank you so much for the opportunity to be your children. Because of Jesus and because of all that you did on the cross, we have the opportunity to connect with you and to know you and to relate to you and to not be enemies of yours anymore. So, Father, I do pray that you give us wisdom and discernment in how we are to unpack the tail end here of Genesis. Lord, thank you so much for the opportunity to dive into your word and to learn more about you in it. Holy Spirit, give us wisdom and guidance as we hear the things we're going to discuss in our time together, and lead us in ways that are going to honor you, Father. Spirit, I pray that you also control my tongue. If there's anything that is not of you, yield it back. I pray that anything that is not true, that you help people forget it. And may I just honor and carry the word in a healthy, biblical way. And I ask for your help as I teach, and as we learn together. We love you so much, Jesus, and we thank you for the opportunity to communicate with you and connect with you and to be eternally connected to the Father and to walk with the Spirit, all because of everything you did and nothing we did. We love you. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, well, as always, I'm going to get rid of my face here so it doesn't distract you all during the lesson. And we'll get going. So again, for the gathering, very excited to jump into our lesson as we finish out our God's Promise series this summer. Again, Pastor Ryan and I are very grateful to teach with you this week and grow with you. And for me, I get the privilege of walking through Genesis 47 through 49 as we talk about Jacob's blessings. Not him being blessed, but as he blessed others. So again, to recap our theme here, the 12-week theme is God's promise, faith through families. God's promise, faith through families. And we started this journey a whole year ago at the last summer when we covered Genesis 1 through 12. And now we're finally wrapping up in about 28 sessions, all of Genesis, which we probably could have taken much more time in all of the Word. But again, we only have so much time to spend together each week. So as we continue on here, let's do a little bit of recap from what Pastor Ryan did when he covered chapters 44 through 46, because we have to look at those things to really understand what's going on here in verses 47 through 49, all right? So first, we do know that in what he taught is that the brothers were being tested by Joseph. So the brothers got together. I taught 2 weeks ago that there was this culminating moment coming up where there was about to be a lot of renewal in this relationship, but there was a little bit of testing that still had to occur. So Joseph did test his brothers one final time, and from that moment the brothers passed that test, and Joseph was revealed that he found out that they had indeed changed, and he revealed himself in a very emotional moment where the brothers were absolutely shocked by what they saw from their brother and the realization that this scene that was going around them was much bigger than they thought. Well, then we see a moment where God was then giving glory in the whole situation, that it wasn't given to man, it wasn't at all given to anyone but the glory of God in the most important thing. So that's another important case because we see this theme where the patriarchs are slowly starting to give glory to God first, and even in all their issues. When we think back to Genesis 1 through 12, the problem was man's decline of giving God glory. So we do see some healthy habits forming in this family. Of course, the family reunion between his brothers and then his father as he met Jacob, and they were reunited into this beautiful moment of tears and joy as Jacob realized that his son was not dead, that God had indeed again provided for him, and that they could continue to connect in beautiful ways. And then finally, we have the provision for Israel, that Joseph did provide for Israel during this famine, and we're going to talk more about that here in a moment as we jump into verse 47, or chapter 47, excuse me. But God did indeed provide through Joseph, and Israel is going to survive this massive famine that hit the entire region during the time period. So again, one more recap of Joseph's life here. We're here at this little bubble, kind of towards the middle in the narrative, We're going to pick up a little bit before Jacob dies. There'll be a 17-year gap between where we start and between the death of Jacob in our narrative today. And then we will cover pretty much up to the point where Joseph's getting older at the tail end of his life here. But we won't talk about his death until the next lesson that'll be coming out shortly. So a lot has happened in Joseph's life. He is finally reconciled and renewed with his brothers. The prophecy and the dreams came true. And we're moving forward now in this family rebuilding and pursuing the future as the patriarchs, as the 12 tribes of Israel. So a little bit about the setting here. We have this travel from Canaan to Egypt, Joseph's family coming from the Canaan region and moving over to Egypt. That little gray area there that's highlighted is Goshen. So this is the area that they settled in. It was a very fertile, lush piece of land. Egypt is this Nile Delta region where it's like a triangle of very lush, fertile soil, pretty much what you see in this picture. But Goshen had an increased level of water availability. They had a lot of really fertile land. So it really was the best land that was available in Egypt. And we're going to talk about how God placed Israel in that area and blessed them in the situation there. A little bit more about Jacob's family tree, because we're going to take a little bit of zoom back. These are all his boys. We know about his daughter. We covered that with Dinah and the tragedy of her story. That's going to come back up here when we talk about Jacob's blessings of his sons. But this is the family. And notice the two grandsons, Manasseh and Ephraim, right, or Ephraim, whatever you want to pronounce it, where these boys are going to be blessed and included in an equal blessing with their brothers, or with their uncles, which is a big deal, which we'll talk about here in a moment. So why don't we get started here with our lesson and start moving forward as we discuss Genesis 47 through 49 and Jacob's blessings. And it has to pick up right where Pastor Ryan left off, where Israel now starts to settle in Goshen during the famine. So Israel was landed in Egypt. This is the Ramses II's great temple at Abu Simbel. It was built around 1244 to 1224 BC. And it's most likely that they came around this time period. The reason I'm showing you this is, one, it's one of the most famous photos we see when we see Egypt. The only thing better, obviously, are the pyramids, the Great Pyramids of Giza. But in this context, it shows that they had a lot of wealth. They had a lot of power. Egypt had a lot of strength to do these things. Their imagery here is of their gods they're trying to honor. So very pagan circumstance. But this is the Egypt that Israel is moving to. A lot of strength and a lot of their own culture. So they really are foreigners moving into a foreign land in their own right. So this is kind of what we have to place ourselves in when we think about where Jacob, where the sons, where all of Israel are coming from and what they're moving into. Also, we need to start paying attention to the fact that this starts setting up the context for the book of Exodus. So now that shift is starting to happen from Genesis to Exodus, and the author wants us to start paying attention to that. So let's talk about the 4 chapters of Genesis 47. We have Joseph's brothers meeting Pharaoh. We have Jacob meeting Pharaoh himself. We have Joseph caring for his family and for Egypt. And then Jacob preparing to die. So the patriarch Jacob is now preparing to know his life is coming to an end, and he's going to give some instruction to Joseph about what that would look like. So let's dive into our first section here of Joseph's brothers meeting Pharaoh. So Joseph went in and told Pharaoh, "My father and my brothers, with their flocks and herds and all they possess, have come from the land of Canaan. They are now in the land of Goshen." And from among his brothers he took 5 men and presented them to Pharaoh. So according to plan, Joseph announces the arrival of his family. The goal from the outset in Joseph's dealings with Pharaoh was to win the pasturage of Goshen. We see that he kind of laid the seed here where he said that they are now in the land of Goshen. He wasn't saying they took the land of Goshen. They're not invaders. They didn't come in and just settle down. He was just saying, look, they moved from Canaan and now they're in a fertile place of Goshen. And Joseph's goal here is to help them settle in that region because it was the choicest land. Joseph also wanted to honor Egypt, so we're going to see this balance of Egypt being blessed and Israel being blessed. But we're going to see Egypt being blessed in a lot of turmoil and Israel flourishing in a lot of turmoil, which is going to be very different in the two comparison. Now, we see this interesting aspect where Joseph only introduced 5 of his brothers to Pharaoh. We don't know exactly why he chose to do that. However, we believe that it might be because he wanted to show a little bit of favoritism expressed towards Benjamin and the 5 years of famine that remained. It kind of gives us that reminder of that time period. The reality is they could have been the brothers that he liked the most. They could have been the brothers that he knew that weren't going to cause the most problems. We know that some of his brothers had anger issues. We'll talk about that again in a little bit here. We don't really know why he only introduced 5 of them. It could also have been not to overwhelm Pharaoh. He might have wanted to show him a piece of his family versus all of his family. Either way, he did start introducing Pharaoh to his brothers and to his family. In a minute, we're going to see to his father. Now, by Joseph informing Pharaoh that the tribe was waiting in Goshen, remember, we want to think that maybe he wanted to plant that idea in the king's mind. The text description of their interview that Joseph presented them also expresses Judah's oath to set Benjamin before Jacob earlier in 43:9. So we see this comparison going on here of setting up things compared to the past. There's this presentation of a positive future, but also with the hope of a blessing coming in the future, especially for Israel and where they're going to land and where they're going to settle. So we continue on the narrative. Pharaoh said to his brothers, "What is your occupation?" And they said to Pharaoh, "Your servants are shepherds, as our fathers were." They said to Pharaoh, "We have come to sojourn in the land, for there is no pasture for your servants' flocks, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. And now please let your servants dwell in the land of Goshen." So the king first inquires about the brothers' station in life. He wants to know their occupation. That Joseph anticipated this, and he knew this was coming along. And so the brothers, for all intents and purposes, would follow Joseph's instructions. Even though they directly request Goshen for their settlement, they wanted to show a proper protocol towards the king. Notice the repetition of your servants. They wanted to show reverence. They shared that they were shepherds, lowly shepherds. A shepherd would have been seen as very lowly in Egyptian culture, so they wanted to come off as not being a threat. They note their family solidarity, that they were together. They're their fathers, as our fathers were. So they have a history. This would have been very important in Egyptian culture. Egyptian culture very much valued lineage. They valued family tradition. They valued strength. They describe their purpose in coming to Egypt as sojourners, as travelers, of those who are trying to who are wandering. This brings to mind Abraham's earlier descent due to famine, where we had these times where Abraham had to go to Egypt as a sojourner the first time and leave. It didn't end well for Abraham, but that was another illustration of what was going to come in the Joseph story later, and then later in Exodus when Israel exits Egypt. So again, this language of being wanderers. And again, this is a movement that prefigures his descendants' migration. So it's showing that what's going to occur in the future, that they will be sojourners again, except God's going to deliver them to the promised land, even though they're going to wander as sojourners for 40 years. So a little bit of illustration of the past, but also allusion to the future in this situation. Now, they imply that the famine was more intense in Canaan. That's what forced them to search out new pasture land, that this area, the whole area of Canaan was very severe. Again, Canaan was less lush and less fertile than Egypt in the Nile Delta. So this was a picture they were trying to paint of death. If they were to go back or not be able to stay, their tribe would pretty much wean out. Again, another reason they showed their family's history is they're trying to get a little sympathy from the Pharaoh. They're also thinking long-term, since it is likely that Goshen cannot immediately support their flocks due to Egypt's own death issues going on. They knew that they had to land in the best region. So there was a lot of wisdom going on here, most likely in my guess, from Joseph, and knowing what was going on in Egypt and then trying to give them a little bit of future guidance of what could be coming down the line. However, regardless, it's understood that in the interim, they're going to be dependent on Pharaoh's goodwill, that they're going to completely rest on what Pharaoh chooses to do. They show, however, no interest or potential in jeopardizing the king's future regime, which is really key. Again, re-hammering the servants and sojourners verbiage and language going on in the text. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since your father and your brothers have come to you, the land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best of the land. Let them settle in the land of Goshen, and if you know any able men among them, put them in charge of my livestock." Now, ancient and modern commentators have really struggled over the suitability of Pharaoh's answer. Some have understood that as a textual confusion between two different accounts, because it seems like there's two little stories going on here. But really what's going on is Pharaoh is stipulating the basis for his kindness that he's going to extend to them. That since section is added by me. Again, I didn't change the word. It comes from another translation of the Bible. But it's a better way to show that the actual translation here is he's saying, since your father and brothers have come to you, meaning, hey, I'm going to be kind because of these things. Because your dad and because your family have come to you, Joseph, I'm going to do the things they do. You can take a look at that in other translations. Again, that since your father is very much in those things. It gives a better depiction of the Hebrew text that's going on here. The foreigners' show of hospitality places them in a positive light, which contrasts strikingly with the Pharaoh of bondage who did not know about Joseph in Exodus 1:8, a different Pharaoh down the line. So you see this relationship of blessing being given from Pharaoh and some appreciation of who the Israelites were, particularly in Joseph. So his blessing is coming from a cause and effect situation. Pharaoh does provide Joseph's family complete discretion in selecting the best part of the land, as he had promised. That was in 45:18 when he promised that. But his language is probably a little bit ceremonial, since he designates Goshen in accord with their previous request. So this is more of a royal edict saying, because you asked for this and because I promised it, I will give it to you, even though he's pretty much made his mind up already that that's what he was going to do. Yet Pharaoh does go beyond Joseph's request by extending employment opportunities to them. This comes in the form of him allowing them to have able men who can be keepers of the land, keepers of his livestock, keepers of things going on. So it's not just being guests or temporary residents. He's given them actual duties and roles in the Egyptian kingdom. So it's an extra blessing. Perhaps also, though, he reasoned that God's blessing also rested on Joseph's brothers as well as Joseph. So Joseph obviously blessed Egypt, helped God work through him to keep Egypt from falling in the famine. And it's very possible that the Pharaoh saw these brothers as extensions of Joseph's family as also blessed. And so he wanted to honor them in what he was seeing on a spiritual level here. Regardless, they were now being accepted and brought into the Egyptian culture. So this brings us to the next stage. The brothers leave, and then Pharaoh meets Jacob, Joseph's father. Then Joseph brought in Jacob his father and stood him before Pharaoh. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Jacob, "How many are the days of the years of your life?" And Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The days of the years of my sojourning are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their sojourning." And Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went from the presence of Pharaoh. So there's a lot going on here. First, the fact that Joseph presented Jacob before the king indicated a very formal audience with the ruler. So this was an official greeting, pretty much one nation greeting another. Think about a lot of pomp and circumstance and an official, highly valued gathering between two influential people in history. Now, Jacob blessed Pharaoh upon his arrival and departed from the king, forms this boundaries of the unit and the relationship in this text going on here. Although blessed may be a formal greeting or farewell, in this Hebrew culture, such formalities assumed an underlying religious significance. So it's not just like a how do you do, it's nice to see you that Jacob's doing. He's actually giving him a religious blessing, asking God to bless Pharaoh in his generosity and kindness. The significance of Jacob's blessing is a departure from earlier patriarchal contacts, though, with foreign rulers. Former patriarchs, Isaac, Abraham, people in the lineage there, would not typically bless foreign rulers. Although officials would enjoy the blessings that occurred from their relationships with those patriarchs, such as Potiphar, for example, there is no other record of a direct blessing of a foreigner by a patriarch. So this is a very unique thing in the story of Genesis. This implies that Jacob was superior, perhaps accepted by Pharaoh because of Jacob's role as tribal head in the senior age. So this polite relationship Jacob had with Pharaoh differs from the hostilities that Abraham and Isaac endured in foreign lands. So this is a very different relationship between Israel and the foreign nations around them right now. Now, this is going to get bad again, obviously, in Exodus. However, right now, you see this interaction of Israel with the world in a more positive light. The implication is clear. The Lord is with Jacob in this land as he is with Joseph. Egypt is a place of refuge for the Hebrews, so it's a safe place for them to settle down. Before, with the patriarchs, they had to leave, whether it's because they did something wrong or because the people around them were evil and not doing good things. It's being very clear here that there's a safe place for them to rest. Now, a couple things is going on here. The inquiry into Jacob's age. One, this reflects the value that ancient Near Eastern cultures placed on longevity. They felt that someone who could live that long would be blessed. And so the king was genuinely interested in Jacob's age because he would have seen an old man that was most likely able to live for a long time, who saw a lot of hardships, and he would have been thinking of that in a divine light, saying, well, the gods, his gods, Egyptian gods, must have blessed that man because, my oh my, he's able to live for such a long time. You also see this repeated mention of the patriarchs. It's pointing toward divine approval. That shows a holy engagement that's going on here. And we see that even in Hebrew culture, that age was tied to divine protection, right? So in a Hebrew culture, age was meant to be a healthy blessing. It shows hearty resilience to difficulties in life. We see that because Jacob describes his life in terms of his forefathers' days and showing that he too was a sojourner just like them, that he too went through difficulties just like them. Yet he's giving him a pointing to God's favor, that God blessed this family, and trying to share a little bit about who his people are to this stranger in Pharaoh. Jacob's in a very reflective mood. That's pretty much what's going on here. And he's recognizing that his life had been scarred by treachery he suffered at the hands of others. A just sentence for his early days of trickeries against Esau when he was younger, but now he's in a later stage where he just got all his boys back. Everyone's healthy. They left a place of famine. He's in an old age, and now he's seeing God's promises bubbling to the surface when he had that at Bethel. These beautiful things where he's now seeing the goodness that God has promised him. And so Jacob is in a reflective time in his life where he's looking back at the history of Israel and looking towards the future. So Jacob blessed Pharaoh. That was a little bit more of a formal exit, again leaving, but it does reinforce the goodwill that the Egyptians and Israelites initially experienced with each other. So it was a very positive thing that was happening here. So again, the key here is it shows a very different relationship than what had occurred previously between the patriarchs and foreign rulers in history. So we switch over now to Joseph's caring for his family and for Egypt. So then Joseph settled his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had commanded. And Joseph provided his father, his brothers, and all his father's household with food according to the number of their dependents. So by settling the Israelites, the Jacobites, in a land of their own property, this imagery foreshadows the establishment of Israel in Canaan later for possession. So it's setting the foundation that this is actually a nation and not so much just a people group that are traveling around. Again, the passage states this land was granted from Pharaoh himself, showing authority that Pharaoh's will was that these folks be blessed. That comes truly from God, but God used Pharaoh to do that. That Joseph provided, that word provided, necessitates for the entire assembly, that it was a fulfilled promise from 45:11, that all his father's household will be blessed. A pledge that he would reiterate to his brothers later in chapter 50, giving them assurance that God has indeed provided for Israel through Joseph and through Egypt. Now that these provisions include the children points ahead to future generations. This is new and hasn't really been seen yet in this story. Joseph is showing that, or the author is showing that not only was Israel blessed currently, but they were being blessed in the future as well. That this is going to be an echo of what's to come later. It might even give a little bit of an echo back when Judah was fearful of the survival of his family and children in chapter 43. But Joseph again alleviates that here, and he'll do so in chapter 50. He's basically trying to tell them everything's okay, God's provided, we're fine. Now this land of Ramses, that's another word for Goshen. So we see that he's being put in a very nice region, a nice area. So the family is settling down. However, not everything is nice because the famine is still going on. As we see here in verse 13, now there was no food in all the land, for the famine was very severe. So the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished by reason of the famine. And Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan, in exchange for the grain that they bought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. And when the money was all spent in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us food. Why should we die before our eyes? For our money is gone." So after the narrative is switching back here to what's going on around them as the family is settling here in Goshen, back to the famine. So after Jacob settles in Goshen, we see this new shift in the story. We see a big stress on the severity of the famine, right? Highlighted there in orange. There was no food in all the land. The famine was very severe. The land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished by the reason of the famine. So it's not just Egypt, it's the entire area was suffering, and people were running out of food. The phrase gathered up here that we see in the yellow, in Joseph gathered up all the money, is similar to scraped together. So this implies that the people of Egypt and Canaan gave every single penny to Egypt so that they could eat. This is how severe the famine was. Now, down in verse 15, we notice that, one, the Egyptians now are having an interaction with Joseph, all right, the people group of the Egyptians, the people. And so everything that's going to come after here is focusing on the Egyptians, which is key as we look at these types of blessings that were occurring, because there's going to be a comparison to Israel here in a few verses. What we see is when all their money is gone, the Egyptians appeal to Joseph for help. Give us food. Why should we die before your eyes, for our money is gone? They're not now freaking out completely because of thinking Joseph's harsh. They're looking at the future saying, if we don't address this now, the future of our lives is death. That's basically what's in the future if we don't do something about it. So verse 16, and Joseph answered, give your livestock, and I will give you food in exchange for your livestock, if your money is gone. So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses, the flocks, the herds, and the donkeys. He supplied them with food in exchange for all their livestock that year. And when that year was ended, they came to him the following year and said to him, we will not hide from my lord that our money is all spent. The herds of livestock are my lord's. There is nothing left in the sight of my lord but our bodies and our land. So Joseph does indeed respond to the initial Egyptian plea. He offers to buy them livestock and give them food. Now we see in verse 17 that this will occur and it'll sustain them for another year. However, we got to look at what's happening here. Some may say, well, that's pretty cruel of Joseph. Why don't you just give him the food? Remember, Joseph had one man of authority above him, and that was Pharaoh. He was operating in an official context where if he didn't help build Pharaoh's kingdom, there would have been a severe punishment for him. And now he's also trying to provide for Israel, his family that just settled here. So there does have to be this trade-off. So he comes up with a solution. Well, give me your livestock, and I'll give you food in exchange for your livestock. Animals were an important set of capital in ancient Near Eastern societies, so it would have been an additional sacrifice to give them grain for animals. He was basically building up the storehouses of the Pharaoh because he had to take something so that he could keep these folks alive, but also protect his family. It's important to note that also, as a side note here, that this is the first mention of the horse in the Bible, and this is the most important beast of burden in Scripture. I'm not really going to go into it, but the horse becomes a very important animal in the future of the Bible, and some may argue that God loved the horse as one of his favorite creations in terms of the animals. Obviously, we were his favorite in creation. I'm really indifferent on that. You might hear that in some commentaries and things like that, but we see that the horses were brought into the picture now. They're going to show up a lot more later in the Old Testament and the New Testament. So just keep in mind, this is the first time that it popped up. Really not important to our story. However, it is important for the grand narrative of Scripture because the horse will be a good illustration used very grandly later in Scripture. Regardless, what's interesting to note here also is that Egypt would become an important source of horses in Solomon's day later in history. So could be some illustration in the future. Just note that this might be a clue to some things coming down the line. For me, I'm not fully sold on it. However, I do believe the significance that now this creature comes into the story based on how God approaches him and treats it, for the future. So again, looking at verse 18, we see that a year had passed, that the livestock exchange between Joseph and the Egyptians did keep them strong and settled, but then food would run out. They needed more food. They ran out of capital to exchange. And so now they're telling Joseph, look, if you don't provide, we're going to die. There will literally be our bodies, our corpses, all over our land. So they're showing the direness of the situation. And again, Joseph has a decision on how he's going to respond. Verse 19, why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for food, and we with our land will be servants to Pharaoh. And give us seed that we may live and not die, and the land may not be desolate. So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. For all the Egyptians sold their fields because the famine was severe on them. The land became Pharaoh's. So, since death was not an option for the Egyptians, they didn't want that for their future, nor did they want their land to die, they offered to sell their own bodies and their land to Joseph for food. So, if Joseph gives them food, they'll be able to eat and plant food. That's how they know that their land won't die. They're able to, one, eat themselves, or feed themselves, but two, can plant the land, sow grain, and keep the land growing so the future of Egypt is bright. We see that again, Joseph consents, and Pharaoh was indeed blessed by Joseph, even in the harshest of times. So we see also, we talk about, they sold their bodies into it. Notice again that so Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. Joseph was working in a position of authority under someone else's authority. So he had these problems that he was trying to solve. Unfortunately, this was pretty common back at that time period where if you had a debt or you needed something, you could sell your family, you could sell yourself into a work context. Egyptian culture is hit or miss on whether you could earn that or work that off. It was very uncommon. However, this was more of an exchange or a capital exchange, food for labor. And at the same time, we'll see in a minute that Pharaoh was now compiling wealth for himself as the king of Egypt, which wasn't really common early on. Even though he's seen as divinity, they didn't own everything until the upper class started to pull their resources together. So we continue on. As for the people, he made servants of them from one end of Egypt to the other. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had a fixed allowance from Pharaoh and lived on the allowance that Pharaoh gave them. Therefore they did not sell their land. So this word here, we have servants that can also be translated to slaves. That's giving you a traditional concept of what's going on here. Pharaoh's priests, just real quick, were exempt from the harshness of the famine because they worked for Pharaoh. They were stewarded by him. Therefore, they did not need to be entered into slavery. They didn't have to sell their land because it already was owned by Pharaoh. They were taken care of in their religious system. This is very historically accurate, as most of the land in Egypt belonged to Pharaoh or the Egyptian temples. So this does run with what we know of Egypt in secular texts and studies as well. Then Joseph said to the people, "Behold, I have this day bought you and your land for Pharaoh. Now here is seed for you, and you shall sow the land. And at the harvest you shall give a fifth to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own, as seed for the field, and as food for yourselves and your household, and as your food for your little ones." And they said, "You have saved our lives. May it please my Lord, we will be servants to Pharaoh." Now, while some scholars believe that Joseph exploits the people's poverty, the response to the people, "You have saved our lives," shows that they were really in a terrible circumstance and they greatly appreciated what Joseph did. It was a very positive thing for them. From their perspective, Joseph provides seed on the understanding that they get to keep some of it for themselves, 4/5 of the harvest. Now it might be, well, why 1/5 to Pharaoh? Well, the Pharaoh could have demanded all of it. Joseph was trying to give the people a majority of their stock that they raised up so they could survive. And he was being graceful, in my opinion. A lot of commentators will agree with that. I'll let you decide. But he is giving them an ability to sustain themselves versus some other civilizations would just say, "No, you give me everything, and I'll give you what I feel you deserve." Now, in such circumstances, a less scrupulous administrator might want to put a burden on the poor, but it does give a little bit of light to Joseph's character as he's trying to provide for them and take care of them. And it's very intimate response he gives for themselves, for their households, and even food for their children. So he's showing that he really does care about them and is trying to help. Again, Joseph was blessed by Egypt. God did bless Joseph through Egypt. And so there was love for Egypt in his circumstance and where he was. So Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt, and it stands to this day. The Pharaoh should have the fifth. The land of the priests alone did not become Pharaoh's. So it became an official law, an official rule. As royal serfs, the Egyptians were expected to contribute 1/5 of their produce to the king. So now it was a grand narrative across the entire kingdom. The temples, again, we see were exempt from taxation. And then this ends the famine narrative. Now we see here, and it stands to this day, the Hebrew text of that, the author is saying that it stands to that day in the author's day. So it's not giving illustration to today, our modern time period. He's saying that, well, this is how it is right now, based on when this text was written. So he's giving illustration or testimony, saying, go prove it. This is what you can see. This is what's going on. This is the culture of Egypt right now in their time period. So we go now to this shift again in the overall narrative where Jacob now prepares to die. Jacob sees his life coming to an end, and he's expressing his wishes to his son. Thus Israel settled in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen, and they gained possession in it, and were fruitful and multiplied greatly. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years, so the days of Jacob, the years of his life, were 147 years. So this is the ending of Israel's move to Goshen. The story's pretty much done here. They've moved in. This is going during the famine. Keep that in mind here in a second. But we see that Israel's promises from God were fulfilled. That Israel, as in Jacob, that the promises given to him at Bethel. While Egypt struggles during the famine, Jacob and his family were shown to be prospering. They gained possession. They were fruitful. They multiplied greatly, which means they would have had to have the food and the provision. They didn't lose much. They were not entered into slavery as they were, at least not yet, as it was shown with the Egyptians. So this is very different. However, it is also anticipating the situation that's going to lead to a problem in Exodus. Why the Pharaoh that would come down the line would be threatened by the Israelites and start pushing them into slavery and start persecuting them. So this blessing would create a problem as we shift later in Exodus in our reading. So we look at verse 28 real quick. We see that Jacob's 17 years in Egypt under Joseph's care echoes the 17 years of Joseph when the Joseph narrative began. So we see a full coming of circle now. 17 years of pain for Joseph, and now 17 years of prosperity for Jacob and for the family of Israel. Jacob's shorter age of 147 years contrasts with the longer lifespans of his ancestors. So that's important. The mention of his age at death is given much earlier in the narrative than what is typically seen in past death testimonies. It also comes back up again later in chapter 49. It's going to depart from the pattern for reporting death of Abraham, Isaac. It's very different. And so the context of chapter 47 makes its inclusion here effective, since the chapter describes the fate of the descendants in the land. So we see this shift of this weaning down of the patriarchs, a different narrative. God's giving us a different view about, hey, we're about to turn a chapter into a whole new part of his redemptive story. And when the time drew near that Israel must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, "If now I have found favor in your sight, put your hand under my thigh and promise to deal kindly and truly with me. Do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. Carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burying place." He answered, "I will do as you have said." And he said, "Swear to me." And he swore to him. Then Israel bowed himself upon the head of his bed. So Jacob's imminent death, age 147, dominates the final episodes of Genesis. This is going to be a big build-up up to chapter 50 and even into chapter 50 a little bit. His desire to be buried in Canaan is later fulfilled. A detailed description will be given in chapter 49, verse 29 through 50, chapter 50, verse 14. Now, we see this phrase, "put your hand under my thigh." This shows an intimate position, an oath-giving, a seriousness. I know it sounds a little odd, especially in our context. It does have a little bit of an endearing nature to it, where he's saying, look, I want you to make a promise from your heart. Jacob bows, possibly in worship or possibly in gratitude to Joseph, which would fulfill Joseph's predicted dream back in 37, verses 9 through 11. And again, it could also be because he was old. But either way, we see this reverence, an old man seeking God, seeking a desire for how his life should end, and looking for an intimate promise from his son. Now, by not explaining why Jacob bowed, Genesis allows pretty much any interpretation. Hebrews 11:21 refers to this, citing the Septuagint, which has Joseph bowing on the head of his staff. You can check that on your own. But what we see here is Israel in a very humble posture, trying to approach Joseph, his son, ask him to do something for him. Also notice the intimacy here. He called his son Joseph. He said, "If I found favor in your sight, put your hand under my thigh and promise to deal kindly and truly with me." It's a loving father. Remember, Joseph and Benjamin were his two favorite boys. So he's going to them saying, my son, please help me. I want you to promise this. And his ask was, "Do not bury me in Egypt. Let me lie with my fathers. Carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burying place." It's very, very intimate. It's not demanding. It's a plead, per se, in the text. And I love Joseph's response, "I will do as you have said." But again, Jacob says, "Swear to me." Joseph swore to him, and then Israel bowed himself upon the head of his bed, either because, again, he was tired or because he was worshiping. But you have this intimate picture, again, between father and son. So that ends out Genesis 47, and we move now into Genesis 48, where Jacob then blesses Ephraim and Manasseh, right? And so we have this shift in the story where another part of Jacob's death story, where now the blessings are being imparted. Remember, Abraham did this. Remember, Isaac did this. Again, the situation was much more tenuous when it comes to Isaac giving blessings to Jacob and to Esau. That won't really be the case, but there's going to be a couple of illusions here and illustrations of what's going on. So the overall outline for Genesis 48, we have the introduction. We have past promises fulfilled and burial of relatives. We have introduction of Ephraim and Manasseh, and then Ephraim blessed more than Manasseh, and instructions about his own burial. Again, a reiteration of what how Jacob would like to be buried. So let's take a look at this introduction as we move forward here. After this, Joseph was told, "Behold, your father is ill." So he took with him his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And it was told to Jacob, "Your son Joseph has come to you." Then Israel summoned his strength and sat up in his bed. Now, Jacob's ill health gives the occasion for the blessing bestowed in chapters 48 and 49. The final three appearances of Jacob in the narrative have him on his deathbed. So the rest of the story, when we have Jacob come up, is, again, when Jacob is dying. The final days of a patriarch are decisive phases in the life of the family when he provides for future heirs. So now he's beginning to hand off his blessings to other generations. Bestowal of blessing by a dying patriarch had irrevocable authority. We remember that from Isaac when he said, I can't take back the blessing I gave to Jacob, Esau. I don't have a blessing left for you. This is a true passing on of blessing, a blessing given from God, given to these men who they're passing on to their children. The description of Joseph's meeting with Jacob has the feeling of a very formal audience, an official, holy, reverent moment. You see this language, your father and your son. It reinforces the significance of the visit and the blessing that ensues. Jacob reflects the importance of the summit when he rallied his strength. So this old man picked himself up and knew this was so important, and it was giving purpose and giving strength to the situation. But then notice this shift at the end. The mention of Israel suits the national implications of the blessing. That he sat up in bed at Joseph's appearance probably reflects the importance of the event at hand. It wasn't just now father and son moment. It was a reference to, okay, this is an Israel moment. This is a national, godly, heavenly significant moment that they're about to walk into. So that sets the scene now for Genesis 48, 3-7, when we talk about past promises fulfilled, burial of relatives. And Jacob said to Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me, and said to me, Behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you, and I will make of you a company of peoples, and will give this land to your offspring after you for an everlasting possession. Now the version of the promises that Jacob utters for Joseph draws especially on his own experience and that of the chief patriarch Abraham. So we see these promises of God being carried forward that we saw in every single patriarch. Jacob is recalling the promises made to him upon his return to Bethel, but that's where Luz comes in, from Padan Aram, when God Almighty appeared and blessed the patriarch in chapter 35, verses 9-15. Although commentators often claim that verses 3-6 interrupt this narrative that we're going to see here in a little bit, verses 3-4 fit very well by giving the basis for Jacob's authority to extend the blessings to others. So this is setting the foundation for authoritative passing on of the blessings given by God. Formal blessings typically included allusions to the historic promises made earlier. In remembering the blessings at Bethel, Jacob omits reference to the change of name Israel, which was central to that occasion. So this again is showing that it's an Israel level situation, a national level promise, and he's getting a little bit away from the personal level. However, his focus is the promise of progeny or family, in anticipation of the blessing that he bestows on Joseph's two sons, which are coming up here in a second. And now your two sons, who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt, are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, as Reuben and Simeon are, and the children that you fathered after them shall be yours. They shall be called by the name of their brothers in their inheritance. So a lot going on here, right? Jacob claims that the sons of Joseph are his own. Now, again, he's not saying I'm their father. He's saying they're my blood, they're my body. They're full inheritors of the blessing. He made them full recipients of this inheritance. He noticed that he mentions Reuben and Simeon, two brothers who did not make good choices, and he's putting these grandsons on par with them, saying they were equally investable as my two oldest sons, who they were the ones who should receive the inheritance, but he's indicating that Ephraim and Manasseh will have full status as Jacob's sons, not merely grandsons, that they're going to get the rightful legacy. We also see this repetition of mine, and it reinforces the new standing that these two boys had with their grandfather in the family. Now, historically, the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh continue to be known as the sons of Joseph, so we see this come down later in Scripture and also in a historical record. As tribal units, the descendants of these two boys will establish the inheritance of their father. Since Joseph is the recipient of Reuben's right of inheritance as the firstborn, according to the chronicler, the sons of Joseph also receive firstborn rights as adopted sons of Joseph. So we see this come up. If you want to learn more about that, look at Numbers 26, verse 28, Deuteronomy 33, 13-17, and Joshua chapter 17, verse 17, if you want to learn more about those things. You can also take a look at 1 Chronicles 5, verses 1-2. Now, the mention of Reuben and Simeon possibly convey another meaning, since these elder brothers did not succeed their father due to discrediting themselves. The implication may be that these two boys, too, will not ascend to the highest rank, safeguarding the esteemed place of Judah. So you might see some lining up where Judah is being fast-tracked to being the true patriarch of the family moving forward. The boys are going to be blessed because of Joseph. They're going to get equal standing, and then Reuben and Simeon are kind of being diluted. Thus, Jacob, Israel, is showing a clearer path for the purity of the nation. Again, you can go whichever way you want with that one, but it seems like there is certainly a plan here that Israel is laying out in his blessing, in his purpose. As for me, when I came from Paran, to my sorrow Rachel died in the land of Canaan on the way, when there was still some distance to go to Ephrath, and I buried her there on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. In addition to the memories of verses 3 through 4, chapter 7 further justifies that Jacob demands in verses 5 through 6 and 7 that he's going to want to be buried in his region. It contrasts this positive condition of Joseph's household and the sorrow of Jacob's experience. So Jacob is essentially reflecting on some painful moments. He's showing that he has a sorrow, a really deep burden in his heart. And again, it's giving him this poignancy of the situation going on. The rationale for this adoption is the premature death of Rachel, the favored wife. So since Rachel had no more children, Jacob counted the sons born to Joseph as his own by proxy, immediately multiplying her tribes. So he's living through his grandsons, essentially saying, look, this is an extension of my beloved Rachel. She died too early. I couldn't have more kids other than you and Benjamin, Joseph. So I'm going to count your boys as the extension of this. There's some harshness in this because remember his other boys and also Leah, there's still a hardened heart here that Jacob is showing. But he's also showing the sorrow that his abundance, his progeny that he had prayed for, he wanted that to extend a bit further, and he's living that out through his grandsons. So then we have the actual blessings of the two boys in the introduction of them. When Israel saw Joseph's sons, he said, "Who are these?" And Joseph said to his father, "They are my sons, whom God has given me here." And he said, "Bring them to me, please, that I may bless them." Now the eyes of Israel were dim with age, so that he could not see. So Joseph brought them near to him, and he kissed them and embraced them. So this looks like it's kind of a shift in the narrative. It could be that there was a second reapproach, that Jacob came back, or Joseph came back to Jacob with the boys, or it could just be a restatement of him verifying that the boys are who they were. There's a couple contrasts here that we have to pay attention to. We see that Joseph is pointing out that his sons are there, that God gave him them as a blessing. We see that Jacob is asking Joseph to bring them to him so that he can bless them, because he's having eye problems. He's old. Again, very common in that age. When you were older at that time period, you would lose your eyesight. Without medical science today, we would do the same thing. But he couldn't see. And this should bring us right back to Isaac, right back to the same thing, except that this time, instead of the horrible circumstance where Jacob stole Esau's blessing, we see a more beautiful natural blessing being handed off to the grandsons. We notice that he kissed them and embraced them. There was physical touch. There was a love there. Again, should bring us right back to what happened in the Isaac and Jacob narrative, when Jacob had to feel, Isaac had wanted to feel Jacob, and Jacob tricked him with the furry arm, making him think he was Esau. There are some illustrations here, but we see that there's more an affectionate taste to this. There's more an affectionate sound to this, that this is more positive and more good and more godly situation that's going on here. So we see that Ephraim was blessed more than Manasseh. Again, very, very important here. Let's talk about it. And Israel said to Joseph, "I never expected to see your face. And behold, God has let me see your offspring also." Then Joseph removed them from his knees, and he bowed himself with his face to the earth. Jacob recognizes that this occasion was purely a divine gift. He never thought he would see his son. He thought his son was dead. Let's not forget. He thought that Joseph was dead. And the fact that he has these grandsons, this is a weeping moment for him, that he's giving God all the glory that he gets to see this offspring. The text vividly details the proceedings of the adoption so that the reader can imagine the drama of Jacob's unorthodox blessing that's about to occur here. Joseph is pretty much choreographing the event. We see that Joseph removed the boys from Jacob's knees, and then Joseph bowed himself with his face to the earth. So he's getting the process going. He wants his boys to be blessed. This is a surprising act of humility, and that he's, by this Egyptian ruler, that he's acknowledging the superiority of his father's mediation of God's promises. Remember Joseph's stature. Joseph, by God, was able to save Israel. Joseph was the top official under Pharaoh. There's no one more powerful than him. Yet here he is, this Egyptian royal, bowing himself, recognizing that his father has grander sovereignty. He has grander superiority, and that he's passing on a blessing from the sovereign God. So he wants to get this process going. He's also helping his elderly father who couldn't see anymore, who's very close to death. And I would imagine also this is a very emotional moment for him, thinking about all the years he missed being with his father and loving his father. Now he knows his journey is coming to an end with his father. And Joseph took them both, Ephraim in his right hand towards Israel's left hand, and Manasseh in his left hand towards Israel's right hand, and brought them near him. And Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on the head of Ephraim, who was the younger, and his left hand on the head of Manasseh, crossing his hands, for Manasseh was the firstborn. So Joseph positions the boys facing Jacob so that his right hand of favor would predictably touch the older brother, Manasseh. That was very common. Again, take us back to Jacob and Esau. There is definitely some crossover going on here. Unexpectedly, by crossing his arms, Jacob rests his right hand on the younger son, Ephraim. That crossing his hands there meant that he did it on purpose. And think of that naturally. You naturally reach forward with both your hands. This shows that Jacob knew, he could see what was going on, and he purposefully did this. This wasn't a mistake, like with Isaac. He did this on purpose. It's an unorthodox nature of Jacob's hands require the narrative's repeated description of right and left. The text here is trying to show that one boy Manasseh should have received the blessing as the oldest brother, and Ephraim should not have. It's pointing to the purposeful motion and hand gestures of Jacob to do this so that it was unorthodox. It wasn't natural in terms of cultural understanding of the time period. And Jacob blessed, and he blessed Joseph and said, "The God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life long to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the boys, and in them let my name be carried on, and the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth." So the preface of the blessing has he, Jacob, blessed Joseph. It's a little perplexing, but again, we see that Ephraim and Manasseh were extensions of blessings from Jacob, or from God to Joseph, and Joseph was blessed by this. So by blessing his grandsons, he is blessing Joseph. Again, blessing the family line through this. So Joseph is being blessed through this action as well. So verse 16 and 20 make it clear that while directed also to Joseph, the blessings do pertain solely to the boys. So while the family is being blessed, while Joseph is being honored, these blessings really are going to affect the boys when it comes to the future. So Jacob goes into a depth depicting his love of God, the God of his fathers and the eternal shepherd. It's someone who took care of him. He's come to this full realization that he has to rest on God, that God has been there for him his entire life. You see in verse 16 that the angel had redeemed me from all evil. This is not referencing an angel. This is actually him giving God another illustration of who God was in his life. Textually, he's depicting God as the delivering angel. This could be a reference to the angel of God and his experience at Bethel that God used to deliver him from Laban or other seasons of escape, but he's showing that God was his deliverer, his protector. And he's asking this deliverer and protector to bless the boys. Now, I put them in brackets, but he asked for three specific blessings. A formal request for blessing, that's the first bracket. The second bracket is a blessing on the sons' future identity and their unity, so who they will be in the future, but also the unity of the tribes, that the name of the fathers Abraham and Isaac will be carried forward. And then the third bracket, a blessing for future generations and descendants, multiplication, more family, a grander nation, more people than can be counted in the stars. So he's passing on three blessings to these boys and asking God to do these things. When Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand on the head of Ephraim, it displeased him, and he took his father's hand to move it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. And Joseph said to his father, "Not this way, my father, since this one is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head." But his father refused and said, "I know, my son, I know. He also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. Nevertheless, his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his offspring shall become a multitude of nations." So the description when Joseph saw is an ironic play on Jacob's blindness, if you think about that. So Joseph is seeing where he believes that his father can't see because he thought his father was visually blind. But moreover, we see this displeasure by Joseph of Jacob and what he did. He believed that it was evil in his eyes. That's how the translation works. Very interesting because Joseph up to this point has been completely reverent of his father. Very rarely have we seen even a glimpse of him not agreeing with Jacob. But here we see this displeasure that Joseph is having a struggle with what he's witnessing. The disapproval of Joseph toward the patriarch's crossing of his hands is predictable. Again, remember, because in that culture, the firstborn son would have gotten the blessing. Joseph attempts to right what he thinks is an old man's confusion when he took hold of his father's arms. He's trying to fix it, thinking that his father might have lost his mind or he can't see. And although Joseph interprets Jacob's hands as misguided, his hands acted upon his wiser impulse. See, Jacob, however, cannot be dissuaded. It is not, he knows what he's doing, and he rejects and refuses to move his hands. And he speaks very tenderly to his son, trying to help him understand that he fully understands what's going on, that he knows what he's doing. He is equally emphatic in answering to Joseph's protest, assuring him that Manasseh too will produce a people that is great. By a division of the inherited blessing between Ephraim and Manasseh, the patriarch alleviates the father's anxiety about the eldest's future. Again, notice that tenderness. I underlined it there for you. I know. He's trying to tell his son, it's going to be okay. It's fine. Ephraim, however, even though Manasseh will be blessed, will be more numerous. You can see that in Numbers chapter 2, Deuteronomy 33. And he will father a group of nations down the line. But in this case, you see this moment where Jacob knows what he's doing. He's passing this on. There is a correlation here with Jacob and Esau, that crossover story. But again, it's more positive, and there's not trickery. There's not foolishness like there was with Isaac. Jacob knows what he's doing. And again, I know, that could be also him referring to, I've experienced this, son. I was at the end of this. I fooled my father, and I want you to understand that I understand what's going on here, and I know what I'm doing. So he blessed them that day, saying, by you Israel will pronounce blessings, saying, God make you as Ephraim and Manasseh. Thus he put Ephraim before Manasseh. So Jacob completes the final stage of the blessing, begun in verse 8, and his blessing builds on the idea of the son's powerful descendants. Jacob predicts that the two tribes will become so celebrated as to be subject of a traditional benedictory when he pushes into that. The Hebrew text has a singular by you, which refers to Joseph as in verse 15. So he's saying this is a blessing by you, Joseph, through Israel has been blessed. And you have this virtual union of the sons with Joseph that permits Jacob to refer to them as his kids, as part of his family. This narrative essentially reinforces the outcome of the episode by the apt phrase, Ephraim ahead of Manasseh. He's saying that this is just how it's going to be moving forward, and this is going to be the blessing that's going to come to Israel through these boys. So then we go to the final section here of Jacob's instructions of his own burial in chapter 48, verses 21 through 22. Then Israel said to Joseph, behold, I am about to die, but God will be with you and will bring you again to the land of your fathers. Moreover, I have given to you rather than to your brothers one mountain slope that I took from the hand of the Amorites with my sword and with my bow. So Jacob underscores that his death is imminent. He leaves with Joseph once again what he had discovered in his trials and what Joseph had already experienced, that God will be with him, that even though I'm leaving, son, God will be with you. It's an endearing moment from a father to a son. It's a repeated thesis in the patriarchal narratives that every time a patriarch died, he shared to the incoming son that God will be with them. God will take care of you. Again, their plural yous we see here, with you, bring you, your fathers. It's a representation of the Israelites as a tribe, but also to Joseph. So it's plural in regards to Joseph, God will be with you, but also Israel, nation Israel, God will be with Israel. To be sure, Jacob repeats the divinely spoken phrase, the land of your fathers, of the instruction given him prior to when he returned to Canaan from Paddan Aram. So he's again reasserting this blessing that God gave him, that God will be with you. He is going to bless you in the future. He's going to give you this utmost blessing. He's not going to leave you, because it is, again, to the land of your fathers. This is a genealogical promise that God has instilled here. So Jacob's prediction forms the basis of Joseph's admonition to the Israelites to return his bones later in chapter 50. And we'll see this kind of be fulfilled here in the next chapter and a half, that this will be delivered. Verse 22 contrasts Jacob's part and that of God's described in verse 21. So as now, to show his full confidence in God's provision for the descendants' future return, Jacob bequeaths a portion of land to Joseph personally. So he's now talking about specific land rights that he's going to get into more in depth here in a moment. I have given you, rather than your brothers, one mountain slope that I took from the hand of the Amorites with my sword and with my bow. Now, there's no word of, whether Jacob had to go fight off the Amorites and get the land back that Abraham had inherited. We don't see that in Genesis, but we do see that something occurred of violence, and that he does have a legal right to this land. He'll reassert that here in a moment. But he's saying, I'm giving this to you, Joseph, rather than your brothers, because he's trusting Joseph with this duty that he can get it done. So now that ends the chapter 48 narrative, and we go into a big narrative with Genesis 49, where Jacob now blesses his sons. This is the final act of a father, where he now goes to all his boys and blesses them. It's broken down into 4 sections: the introduction, the tribal blessing, instructions about burial again. Notice that importance. We're in the 3rd chapter now we've covered, and that instructions about burial occurs, and then Jacob's death at the end of the chapter. So let's talk about this introduction, because it is really key that when we see this, the word Israel your father that's going to come up in Israel marks the framework of the unit. So in verses 1 through 2, you're going to notice that he says Israel your father. And then in verse 28 of chapter 49, you're going to see Israel their father. So it's these bookends of this oracle that's about to be shared. The blessings of each tribal son are the central segment of chapter or verses 3 through 27. So this whole thing is about him passing blessing onto the boys. And the patriarch calls for the gathering of the sons of Jacob for his official blessing. We're going to see that in verses 1 through 2, presumably pronounced from his deathbed. So essentially, Jacob is dying in this moment. This is his actual death, and he's giving his final rites to his sons. The concluding verse will summarize at the end of this in verse 28 the character of the preceding blessings, identifying the sons of the 12 tribes of Israel. This is Israel going from a person to Israel going to a nation. So again, this is going to dictate a lot of the Old Testament and also into the New Testament here in these blessings. Then Jacob called his sons and said, "Gather yourselves together that I may tell you what shall happen to you in the days to come. Assemble and listen, O sons of Jacob. Listen to Israel your father." So admonition from father to son exhibits the parental role of instruction. He's saying, boys, listen to me. I'm your dad, and I need you to listen to this. I have exhortation. He's also giving a prophetic tone, saying these are things that are going to occur in your future. Notice again that gather around, it occurs figuratively for the death of Jacob, meaning come around, scrap together, get yourselves together, boys. We need to talk. And the expression in days to come reinforces the composition orientation of the future. That's where the prophetic voice comes in here. So this same language in the prophets announces the events of Israel's future restoration and preeminence that we see in Isaiah chapter 2 verse 2, Daniel 10:14, and Hosea 3:5. So this language is meant to be prophetic on purpose. So let's move into these blessings of all the boys. Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might and the first fruits of my strength, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power. Unstable as water, you shall not have preeminence, because you went up to your father's bed, then you defiled it. He went up to my couch. So we could spend an entire summer on each one of these sections and unpack it. So I'm going to give you kind of the Cliff Notes version of every son's blessing here. So essentially, the oracle is being broken down for every boy, which I've noted at the top here in the chapter designation, the text designation. But the first thing is he is addressing Reuben, his oldest son. And he's saying that you are my firstborn. All of Jacob's might, his first fruits of his strength, his dignity and preeminence and power was placed in him. But Reuben was like unstable waters. He is now being cursed. He's saying you will not inherit the kingdom. You are not going to inherit my blessing, because you went up to my bed and you defiled it. You went up to my couch. You defiled my concubine. This is the coming back of what occurred earlier in Genesis, where we see that this is full circle act of Reuben when he tried to assert his authority in chapter 35, verse 22, that he tried to take over the family. This has come back where Jacob's saying, no, your punishment is you will not inherit the leadership of the family. You are unstable as water. You're not reliable. You will not have any ownership because you defiled my body. You dishonored me. You went up to my couch. That's a very raw and intimate expression, basically saying you slept in my bed. How dare you? That's awful. So I'm giving you nothing. Simeon and Levi, he's working down the elder list here, right? So Simeon's the second oldest, and Levi would have been the third. Simeon and Levi are brothers. Weapons of violence are their swords. Let my soul come not into their counsel. O my glory, be not joined to their company. For in their anger they killed men, and in their willfulness they hamstrung oxen. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. So Simeon and Levi were the two brothers. Remember Shechem, when they pretty much slaughtered Shechem out of their anger. And again, their sister Dinah, she was raped, and horrific, tragic case. But they went beyond justice. They went and got revenge, and just out of their own anger, destroyed the whole city. The other brothers would come in and help pillage it. But they were weapons of violence with their swords. So Jacob is asking God to not let his memory be tied to these two boys. They brought them shame in that moment. They brought them, the family, complete horrific attachment to the family name. They killed men. They hamstrung oxen. That shows that there was a sense of cruelty to how they killed these men. They didn't just kill them. There was a cruelty to this. And so he's saying, cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. He's asking God to divide them in Jacob and scatter them in all of Israel. So the tribes of Simeon and Levi, Levi particularly, would not be given their own nation, essentially. They wouldn't be given a ton of land. They would be scattered amongst the people of Israel. They both obviously have their places in the redemptive story. But in this case, these things would happen, that they would not develop prominence. The Levites, again, would receive 48 cities later in Joshua, but they would be distributed throughout all the tribal areas. They wouldn't be given their own core land. The Simeonites would obtain land within the territory taken by Judah. So they were divisive because they took land from their brother. So this would come down prophetically later in the history of these two brothers and their tribes. Genesis 49, 8 through 10. This is Judah. There's a lot here, so we're going to do the best I can to cover as much as I can. Judah, your brothers shall bepraise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's son shall bow down before you. Judah is a lion's cub. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He stooped down. He crouched as a lion and as a lioness. Who dares rouse him? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. So this is second in length only to in terms of the blessings, only to Joseph, which is going to come down later. This pronouncement depicts Judah as a stalwart, as a lion, someone who's bold and who's a leader, who should be feared, someone who's going to be reigning upon his brothers, and that people will bow down before his people and his tribe. Historically, this verse provides for the Davidic dynasty, which creates the messianic expectation in Israel. You can see that in 2 Samuel 7, verses 13 through 16. Now, this oracle has been notoriously difficult in the history of interpretation. However, what I'm going to say is this, that early Jewish interpretation commonly applied the passage to the Jewish Messiah, and then in Christian communities early in the church, interpreters related it to David and Jesus Christ. That's all I'm going to say, because again, that's a totally other different conversation for another time. But early Christians exegete this tie mainly to the prophecy and aspects of Christ. So there's some Christological references here that are going on in history, and I would affirm that also. So Judah receives a long and positive blessing from his father. He's boasting about how amazing he is as a lion's cub. He's even saying, "You came from a lion. You came from me, my son. You came into the line of amazing prosperity and blessings." He's saying that he's going to have a royal future, that the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet. Again, in my opinion, and a lot of others' opinions, a messianic showing of the future. And he's saying that to him, to this ruler, all the people in the nations will be obedient to Judah, to this line. Binding his foal to the vine and his donkey's colt to the choice vine, he has washed his garments in wine and his vestures in the blood of grapes. His eyes are darker than wine and his teeth whiter than milk. So again, showing that this line, that Judah's family line, will be one that be very blessed, that they would be hard workers and they would be humble and they would be extremely extravagantly loved on. The picture here presents accords and later statements that link the Davidic dynasty with agriculture and prosperity. The royal line of Judah culminates with Jesus Christ. So you see these amazing connections that are going on here, that Judah will be exceptionally blessed for the future. So then we go to Zebulun. He gets one short line. Zebulun shall dwell at the shores of the sea. He shall become a haven for ships, and his borders shall be at Sidon. So even though Issachar preceded Zebulun the birth by Leah as her fifth and sixth sons, Zebulun is the first in our text, and even is mentioned the blessings of Moses later in Deuteronomy 33. Essentially what's going on here is Zebulun his tribe could have been greatly influential in trade in the region of Canaan, later Israel. He could have been tied directly to the Phoenician trade routes. Phoenicians were extremely blessed in the Mediterranean as folks who mastered the sea, that they were a great trading civilization. And Zebulun's tribe would have been on the fringes of these, so they could have served as the fringe of trade. Either way, they shall be very blessed, and they're going to become a haven for ships, a safe place for economic growth and prosperity. So he got a positive blessing, mostly, here in the story. Now Issachar. Issachar was a strong donkey crouching between the sheepfolds. He saw that a resting place was good and that the land was pleasant. So he bowed his shoulder to bear and became a servant as forced labor. Now this comes off as a blessing at first, but essentially they're saying that Issachar is a strong donkey, someone who can carry a burden. But at one point, his people are going to find a place of rest between the sheepfolds. Sheepfolds can also be translated to saddlebags. Either way, it's saying he found a safe place between carrying two burdens, most likely two different people groups, two different nations. And so when he saw that there was a time to rest, his people were going to take a time to rest and just not move forward. They were going to stop developing, and they're going to They're going to carry the burdens between these two nations, these two people groups, and essentially become a servant of forced labor. So not very positive, even though his people will find rest. He's going to end up in his own laziness and in his own passivity. His people are going to carry burdens of other nations, and then they're going to become servants of forced labor in those circumstances. Not a very good blessing as you move forward, at least not in my opinion. So then we take a look here at Genesis 49, 16 through 18. Dan, which means judge, shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan shall be a serpent in the way, a viper by the path, that bites the horse's heels, so that his rider falls backwards. I await for your salvation, Lord. So a couple things going on here. Jacob sees in Dan and his descendants both positive and negative attributes. There's a real play on words here where he calls him judge, shall judge his people, because Dan, the name Dan means judge. Jacob predicts that he will provide justice for his people as one of the tribes of Israel. The picture of the Danites during the settlement period shows that the tribe looking after its own interests is a small tribal unit. Dan is likened to a snake that effectively brings down a horseman, so a very small group that's going to bring down big creatures or big interlopers. They're going to tear down evil around them. A tactic of surprise. A surprise attack brought down the more prosperous but trusting city of Laish that we see in Judges 18, verses 7, 10, and 27. There is a little bit of a reflex of the garden imagery here going on, where snapping at the heel injures the victim. Moreover, heel in verses 17 and 19 recall the play on Jacob's name. So the picture of Dan is not as victim, but victimizer, like the serpent in the garden or Jacob the deceiver. So Dan isn't necessarily in his people ones of defense. They're actually folks of offense, clever, a little bit of carryover from their father, a little bit of snipping at the heel, and not a negative trait, and that's going to play out later. Now, this verse, I wait for your salvation, O Lord, this is a pause in the oracle given by Jacob, where he's basically saying, oh, Lord, he's giving a brief prayer saying, please, Father, watch over my descendants. Without divine deliverance, they will not survive. So there's this pause in the oracle as he's moving forward here. Gad, raiders shall raid Gad, but he shall raid at their heels. So, essentially, Gad is going to be raided in the future. His people are going to be raided, but he's going to raid them right back. The mention of the enemy's heels infers that their tactics will be stealthy and ones of surprise, but he's going to go back and take them right back. Gad will become a little bit of a fighting group of people where they strike at the heels of their enemies and attack people. We'll see that in Lamentations 5:5. We see that in other portions of Scripture. But essentially, the descendants of Gad, which will be located in the region of Gilead, east of the Jordan River, will be attacked by raiders, but the Gadites will be able to be skillful warriors and fend them off and later be this powerful little tribe within the people of Israel that are going on here. Asher's food shall be rich, and he shall yield royal delicacies. Jacob briefly indicates that Asher's descendants will enjoy a prosperous future, that their territory that will later come along the coastal plains of Akko will provide them fertile land and harbors. However, this could be a negative tone of the blessing because Asher's future and achievement are diluted later in Scripture. Either way, seemingly a positive blessing for Asher. Naphtali is a doe let loose that bears beautiful fawns. This tribe will flourish. They are going to be nourished by the rich natural resources where they'll land in the upper Galilee region. Here, this doe is seen as being free to roam and presumably propagate, to multiply. The word here, set free, can refer to spreading limbs. Thus, the metaphor is spreading stock. So, basically, your tribe is going to flourish. You're going to grow, and you're going to do just fine. But then we come to Joseph, the longest blessing here. Joseph is a fruitful bough by a spring. His branches run over the wall. The archers bitterly attack him, shot at him, and harassed him severely. Yet his bow remained unmoved. His arms were made agile by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob. From there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. So a few things are happening here also. So this is where Joseph is getting a very big blessing. He's given pretty much three blessings here. Prosperity, protection, and blessings. So let's talk about verse 22, prosperity. Joseph's affluence in this three-part oracle is likened to a fruitful vine, a vibrant stream that's going to be fed, that's going to grow. He's going to have a prodigious tree whose enclosure cannot accommodate the thriving plant. That's the imagery being used here. Basically, he's going to thrive completely and grow. But then you see this section in verses 23 where you have this this protection narrative where there's folks who are going to bitterly attack him or shoot at him and harass him. However, his bow is going to remain unmoved. His arms are going to be made agile. By the hands of God of Jacob, he's going to be able to fight back. He's going to be able to stand firm. So there's some illustrations here and allusions that maybe these bitter attacks and shots and harassment are going to come from his brothers. The reason why is because the Hebrew words being used here are similar to when he had fears of Esau coming after him. So it is possible that the brothers are actually the attackers, and he's saying that you're in these attacks, you're going to stand strong and you're going to be okay when I'm gone. You're going to be fine by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob, by my God. You're going to be covered. From there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel, that you're going to be completely watched over. Now by the God of your father who will help you, by the Almighty who will bless you with blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that crouches beneath, blessings of the breast and of the womb, the blessings of your father, and mighty beyond the blessings of my parents, up to the bounties of the everlasting hills, may they be on the head of Joseph, and on the brow of him who was set apart from his brothers. So notice the repetition of blessings here. Blessing, 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 blessing. He's anticipating the future where Jacob prays that Joseph's descendants will experience blessings upon blessings upon blessings and exceed those shown to Abraham and Isaac, who was set apart from his brothers. Jacob's final remark may compare Joseph to the Nazarites, the holiest lay people in Israel, that's in Numbers 6, or it may simply be referring to his leading role among his brothers. Regardless, Jacob is claiming that the present blessing bestowed on Joseph surpasses those of the past, whether of the ancient mountains or of their fathers. So he's asking him for abundant blessings that are never going to run out. So Benjamin, we get down to the young little Benjamin here. Well, Benjamin is a ravenous wolf, in the morning devouring the prey, and at evening dividing the spoil. So youngest of the 12, appropriate to be addressed last. This area shows another metaphor with an animal, a ravenous wolf. This morning and evening reference is a merism, showing that the wolf is continually on the prowl. So Benjamin is going to be continuously on the prowl. So numerous are the victims during the morning hours that he's going to be spent gorging on prey at nighttime. You can even see illustrations of that in Isaiah 33:23. The evening wolf is the most deadly, and after the kill, it parcels out the carcass. So you have this illustration of Benjamin's going to be a ravenous wolf. A brutal picture of Benjamin's future is very surprising because he, though important to the narrative plot, is a completely passive character up to this point in Joseph's story. He's depicted oppositely in the blessings of Moses in Deuteronomy 33:12, where he is at rest in the safety of the Lord. However, the picture of Benjamin's aggressive character predicts the military feats of Benjamin and the Benjaminites, during the settlement and early monarchy periods, despite their small size as a tribe. 1 Samuel 9, Psalm 68, Judges 3, 5, 20, 1 Samuel 9, 2 Samuel 2. This tribe was a mighty tribe, a tribe of warriors. They'd be renowned for their skill as left-handed marksmen and for their bravery. So Benjamin, little Benjamin, quiet Benjamin, at least in the story here, his people are going to be amazing warriors. They're going to fight in the future for Israel. So then the conclusion, verse 28, all these are the 12 tribes of Israel. This is what their father said to them as he blessed them, blessing each with a blessing suitable to him. The final verse of the section is a closing narrative frame, providing a conclusion to the patriarch's deathbed benediction. The summary statements are made in 3 points. First of all, the 12 tribes of Israel receive recognition, including the discredited sons, Reuben, Simeon, and Levi, and the less significant sons of the narrative. Second, the blessing had the authority of their father Jacob, who alone could pass on the blessings promised to the fathers. And then third, the blessing each son received was appropriate to each tribe's role in the nation. Essentially the blessing of Jacob therefore reinforces the unity of the future nation, but also discriminates among them, realizing that each tribe will have its distinctive story. So yes, all of Israel will be blessed and will be given blessings in the future. However, it's going to be based on their individual stories and individual tribal histories coming in the future. And these come from Jacob that are legitimately be able to pass down from him to them by God, given to him in authority. And by the way, each blessing was appropriate to each family member. So now we have this final closure of Jacob's life, where he gives instructions about burial once again. And then he commended them, the brothers, and said to them, I am to be gathered to my people, bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite. So he's anticipating his death, and he's giving him one last hammer at how he wants to be buried, saying that I want to be buried with my family. I want to be gathered to my people. I want to be family solidarity in this time with my fathers. The location of the burial site and its history are repeatedly stated to show that it is a legal right for him to be buried there, and the importance of him for that to be done, to be put in a precise burial location. In the cave that is in the field at Machpelah, to the east of Mamre, in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. There they buried Abraham and Sarah his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah his wife. And there I buried Leah. The field and the cave that is in it were bought from the Hittites. So Jacob adds how the cave came to be owned. He's saying we have legal right to do this. I have a right to be buried in this land of Canaan. Abraham bought it legally, so this needs to be done. And he shows the importance of it because he gives a triad of who was buried there in his genealogy. They buried Abraham with Sarah there. They buried Isaac with Rebekah there. We know that he couldn't have buried Rachel with him because he buried Rachel in Bethlehem, but she got equal right because they set up an altar for her, a memorial for her. But notice that he's saying, there I buried Leah there. So Leah had died. Jacob had buried her there, so he has an intent to be buried with Leah, which is very interesting because he didn't really love her. She was definitely not his favorite by any means, yet he is saying, hey, you know what? I want to be buried with her. So this could show some final unity in the family. Finally, Jacob embracing all his boys and closing the circle there just a little bit. Well, then we go to verse 33. When Jacob finished commanding his sons, he drew up his feet into the bed and breathed his last and was gathered to his people. So the benediction for his sons and the final instructions regarding his burial permitted Jacob to take his last breath in peace. The verse contains stock phrases describing death and burial. He drew up his feet. He willingly went. He was ready to die. He's dead, waiting for the realization of the promises that are going to come when his people are gathered together. And then you have, again, that customary expression, gathered to one's fathers, meant that Jacob was united with his dead ancestors. The imagery is a deposit of human remains with others in collective burial sites, that now Jacob's life has fully come to a close, and the story is over. So now we go into the next transition, where Israel has to move forward. This is an imagery of the procession that Joseph could have done for Jacob to be buried in that burial plot, but the story is over. However, we have one story we have to cover, and that's in Genesis chapter 5, that Pastor Ryan and I will cover in a bonus session, where we talk about this gap between shifting from Genesis to Exodus. Thank you so much. I hope you've enjoyed this lesson. I'm looking forward to talking to you soon. God bless.